If you haven't seen part 1, this series covers every Ludum Dare jam game I've ever made to date. My first 8 games from 2014 through 2017 are covered in part 1. This part covers the further 11 games I've made since then. Enjoy! Tribal Tension. The event was LD38. The theme was Small World. I had just recently learned how to read Twitch chat from a Game Maker project, and I just had to try something with that. I created an island that tribes would battle for, controlled by Twitch users. At first, each player would control a tribe itself, but I wanted the game to support far more players, so instead it became a team-based game with each player able to control a single villager at a time. That villager could be commanded to chop wood, build houses, build catapults and towers, and lead armies on an attack. This was so much fun to make. It was one of, if not the most, satisfying projects I've made for a jam. I kept working on this for some time and even paid an artist to help me improve the graphics for a new version I would run on my live streams regularly during breaks. I've kind of forgotten about it a bit though these days. It's a weird, kind of flawed, but incredibly unique game. I would love to revisit the concept of chat-based games like this. The challenges and opportunities they present are so unique. Loads of games and streamer interaction things have been made since then, of course, but this really was at the time quite a fresh concept. Running out of power was the theme for LD39, but as usual, the game I make is more influenced by my current state of mind than the theme. I had just been learning about how 3D in Game Maker works, or how the rendering is technically always 3D, and it's just quite literally a matter of perspective. With that in mind, I decided to create a fake 3D game about flying a drone to collect parts of your broken spaceship. The same story as Space Shifter. Recovering parts of a broken vehicle or spaceship is a thing I seem to do a lot for some reason. Since they were drones, you would control them via an onboard camera, and the drones would lose signal if they flew too far from the ship or ran out of battery power. Technically, I made the game first person. You were stranded at the ship and could physically see your drone flying in the background if it was in front of you. You could even see the first ship part that you needed to recover as a sort of tutorial. The instructions for the drone were written on a cute pixel art clipboard. I loved the style of this one a lot. It felt extremely immersive and real for what it was. I love it when games come together in a way where everything kind of makes sense and does what you would expect. On an unrelated note, this jam also taught me how video compression works, because my stream would lag out massively anytime I showed the distorted noise effect. It turns out loads of rapidly changing pixels like this hugely increases the size of the video data. When pixels stay the same, it gets smaller. You might notice this if you watch a friend stream a game or a movie, and it seems to sometimes drop in quality massively, but if they pause or it's on a not busy scene, it would be really smooth and high quality. Anyway, I just thought this was interesting, and making this game taught me about that. I got no final ratings as I simply didn't rate enough games myself, and therefore did not receive enough ratings. It's a pretty fair system, I just didn't have enough time. Dark Space 8 was my first experience of truly over-scoping. I tried to make Darkest Dungeon in space, which, wasn't going to work in 48 hours, was it, Sean? The theme was, the more you have, the worse it gets, and my idea was going to be that you had to escape a massive space station that was being invaded. You would find other survivors and equipment, but the more you would bring with you, the more risk it would present. By the time I finished, none of that really came across. In fact, the more people you had, the better, really. You just had more people and more guns, and it made the game easier. I got something that did feel kind of nice as a game by the end, but it didn't get my original concept to work how I wanted. It was too much. Procedural dungeon, random events, an entire turn-based combat system, RPG stats. There were a lot of things I'd never done before, and while I'm proud of the entry and what it taught me, this was one of my weakest final projects from my perspective. It placed 157th in fun, which is still pretty respectable, and I really liked the graphical style and randomly generated party members. Using a dissolve shader on units that were killed was very satisfying too. Tower of Cards was also not the best entry I've ever made, but the concept was fun to play with. In my defense, LD53 had the stupidest theme I've ever seen, which was combine two incompatible genres, which by definition makes no sense. If you combine two genres and you make a good game, then they were never actually incompatible, were they? If they were incompatible, then they'd be incompatible and the game would suck. I guess what was really meant was to combine two genres you just wouldn't expect to be compatible, or that it hasn't been done before or something, but even then I hate this theme. It just tells you to take tropes and mash them together, which is the most dull, boring, and obvious method of creative synthesis that exists. It's Skyrim meets Minecraft. And if you think that sounds cool, you're wrong. It's stupid, it's boring, and it's why we're stuck in a rut of stupid, safe game ideas and endless remakes and... Anyway, sorry for the unrelated rant, I just Really hated this theme. Anyway, I made a tower defense deck building game. That sounds like genres that would actually be quite compatible and fun, you say? Exactly, that's why I did it. This theme is stupid. Sorry. Anyway, I'd never done pathfinding before. I like to try and do at least one thing I've never done before when I make a jam game, which is a blessing and a curse. I learned a lot, but it ate so much time that I didn't really get enough game going, but the cards did feel nice to select and play to make the towers. By combining two genres, I'm sort of trying to make two whole games here though, and there just wasn't enough time to make it feel complete and have any magic really shine through. But I think it proves a concept on a bare bones level. LD42, however, we finally get another banger. Fireball was sick. Yeah, I'll blow my own horn, this game rocks. Making a game that relies on multiplayer for a jam felt like a disaster in terms of getting ratings, but there's just something in it. I don't know if it's my history in competitive fighting games and love of competitive games in general, but something about making them and working on them scratches some indescribable itch and often brings out the best in my skill set. The theme was running out of space, and the game was effectively the emergent game Spleef from Minecraft, where you try and knock the ground out from under your opponents in an arena. Only in my game you were a wizard that could charge and shoot fireballs. The rules and setup was simple, and so really there were just two things to really spend time on. Fun mechanics and rules, and really good game feel. This is the key to a good jam game, something where the basics come together fast, and your only job is to pour on polish and iterate. I added some extra stages, but I didn't really need to. It was all just in making fireballs feel good, moving feel good, winning feel cinematic, and loss feeling funny. I've played this locally with friends, and even made it supported to 8 controllers, and had an absolute blast. I also recently ported the game to GameMaker's new rollback netcode system, so you can play it online on Opera GX. The weakest point is that the game is stupidly hard, and a bit weird to control, as my experimental action games always seem to end up that way, but I think the concept makes that shine. It's funny how many players just end up running off the edge and dying in the first few seconds. People often tell me this has potential for loads of different game modes, etc., but I think its relative simplicity is what makes it. Pick a cool wizard sprite, shoot at your friends, fall into space. All Become One is a game I tend to forget that I made. It was inspired by the god game Black and White, so you can imagine how terribly overscoped this one was. The theme was your life is currency, and my take was that as a god you could absorb life force and use it to fuel your godlike powers. This created an interesting little sandbox, but the thing with jams is there's a pressure by the end to make the game into something that has a goal and can be finished. Clear rules and a score or credits or something. So it ended up being a bit of a village protector game where you made towers to defend against waves of invaders. This felt really forced though, and ultimately I think I just wasn't able to find what this game should really be about, so I made it something quite generic and not that interesting. The effect for absorbing life force of trees and villages is something I actually reuse in my current project Pokepoke to this day as part of the death animation. I also like the art style here, which felt like an evolution of the style for Life is Short and Tribal Tension and my various other games with villagers and tribes. Not my best entry, but an interesting one nonetheless. It still placed 50th in fun and 93rd overall because people just like tower defense games, which, to be honest, fair. LD45 was one of the rare jams I actually finished early. I think Box was really the only other one. The theme was start with nothing, and wanting to correct for my overambition in recent jams, I decided to go extremely back to basics and create the simplest thing I could think of. It was, of course, still absurd and experimental. I decided to make a game where you use a mouse to interact with stuff that would appear over time in order to gain points. So at the start, balloons would appear, and you click them for points. But other than the fact the game is called Click the Balloons, nothing else about the rules is explained whatsoever. After a while, fish start to appear. You can drag them around, and when they hit the walls, they turn around and you gain points, but sometimes you also lose points, and it's not explained why. Spoiler alert, it depends whether or not the fish is above or below the vertical center of the screen when hitting the wall. You just have to work this out by trial and error. More and more things start to appear with completely different, completely arbitrary, completely unexplained rules. There are shapes that appear which cause you to rapidly lose points unless they're placed in the right quarter of the screen. The quarter each shape belongs to randomizes each playthrough. The game is deeply confusing and frustrating, and for some reason that's just what I wanted to make. It's almost anti-design, I don't know. Eventually, even if you worked out all the rules, the act of spinning all the various plates gets very difficult. Perhaps I'm denying a lot of people an actually interesting chaos management game by creating this frustrating puzzle-solving wall in the way, but I don't really care. This game is in many ways deliberately bad, but it makes me laugh whenever I remember making it. I have no idea how this even placed in the top 500 for fun. A car with no name saw me return to being far too ambitious. The theme was Keep It Alive, and inspired by a combination of indie game Jalopy, the desert chapter of Gods Will Be Watching, and the song A Horse With No Name, I wanted to create a game in which you drive a dilapidated, rusty hovercraft land speeder type vehicle across a desert planet. Ideally running into all kinds of fun random events along the way, and regularly having to stop and repair your craft or replace engine parts, etc. Much of my initial time was spent just trying to get the vehicle working and have it carry the player properly, along with making it modular and able to be repaired and have its parts taken out and put back in, etc. I wanted the car to feel real, like it was really just a mishmash of parts held together by paper clips. But therein was the trap. I'd made an action game that needed content. By the time I was done making the car work, there was no time to add anything to this desert. No enemies, no events, certainly no towns or NPCs, all the things that would actually bring this kind of game to life. There was just never going to be time for the scope necessary. Even if I decided to make this a 72-hour entry instead of 48, I knew there was no way I was going to get enough done. So I settled for a loop of get as far as you can to the right, while occasionally having to fix the car, avoid rocks, and drink water. Really, I think this game is the closest I've come to an abandoned or unfinished entry, but it is playable. My favourite aspect, I think, is that you can set the car going and then just walk around on the car, check the radar, etc. I love this feeling of cruising on a transport in games. There's something about immersive real-time transport, like the train at the start of Half-Life. It's just some kind of magic, I don't know what it is. The next LD saw me essentially evolve that previous idea and optimize it for a jam environment. The theme was stuck in a loop, and I created another game about traveling to the right in a modular vehicle, this time a spaceship carrying the last of humanity in hope of finding a new home, presumably because of some unexplained doom that had befallen their old home. You also possess a strange alien artifact that can reset the timeline and let you try again and again until you get the ideal future for humanity. This time, instead of making a real-time action game like a fool, I created a narrative text adventure with ship modules as little bubble items. I leveraged a ton of Juju's Scribble library to create text boxes, buttons, and tooltips. In the end, I created a really cool modular framework for throwing out random events with branching choices, and got to enjoy writing some sci-fi nonsense. This one calls back to the problems with my very first LD game, Planestroller, as it still relied on having content, and there just isn't time to make much content in Ludum Dare. But since it was all largely just text I had to add, I was able to add just enough to make it interesting for a handful of playthroughs, as opposed to a car with no name that would have needed code, art, design, and so on for every kind of content I wanted to add. I have plans at some point to make this game properly open source with like a GitHub page, etc. I want to make the events a bit less hard-coded and more modular and easy to add, but then I think if other people collaborated and just added more and more text content to the game, it could end up being something quite special. This was a really fun data-driven project. All the items and most of the event stuff is all in JSON files. Learned a lot about structure in this one too. LD48, Depth. This is one of my favourite entries of all time. The theme was deeper and deeper, and I decided to create an infinite falling game with a sort of PS1 hyper low res 3D aesthetic. The mood and feel of the game was very inspired by Devil Daggers and my own nostalgia for the strange, spooky, liminal vibes of early 3D games. This is an aesthetic I absolutely adore and I'm dying to work more in. The feel of this game is so cohesive, and I'm extremely proud of the sound design. Someone described the thud on hitting the ground as sickening, and no description for something I put into a game has brought me as much joy. This was exactly what I was going for. I don't think I've ever been as happy with the aesthetic of one of my games as this one. It's an accessibility nightmare as the spinning makes a lot of people feel ill, but it's just such an important part of the horrifying feel of falling endlessly into the abyss. I also really love the transitions between areas, these little tunnels that build suspense and anticipation before revealing an entirely new area. The game is really hard because, I mean, have you met me? And some people really wanted to see checkpoints between the areas, and if the game were longer I'd maybe agree, but I think there's something really special about seeing how far you can get in that one run. The thrill of being in a new area and the anxiety of not knowing what's coming next. You just can't get that feeling with checkpoints. One day I'd really love to bring this to mobile or something. On a technical level, I'm very proud of doing quite a lot with very little. I could basically only make solid convex volumes with the 3D tech that I wrote. I could also move them around, but that's it. The texturing I could do was also limited, but gosh, I just really love this entry. It might be my favourite LD game ever, to be honest. Its absurd difficulty I think keeps it from being a high placer, though it did do extremely well in theme, but it was worth it to enjoy watching people try hard their way through the game on Twitch. Finally, or most recently, we have LD49 and Unsustainable, a pseudo-RTS game about guiding the last living people out of a dying world. In many ways, this game was a refined approach to some of the ideas in All Become One. Much better equipped as a developer to create things like pathfinding and unit selection, I braved the terrifying world of RTS-style games once again. This time with a lot more success. It was still hard, but I think I'm finally getting the hang of creating these types of controls and mechanics. One big challenge was creating the procedural massive world of tiles that was changing and decaying over time. How do you update that much data every few seconds? Well, it turns out you don't. I basically ended up only updating tiles that were visible or near visible, and then running a kind of catch-up system on other tiles as they came closer to being in view, which was not a perfect solution, but a very invisible one to players who weren't aware of it. Proud of this entry and what it taught me. It has an interesting game loop, though I think still suffered a little from needing a game loop and a goal. I'd really like to make a game like this where I commit to the idea of just making and growing something for the sake of it, rather than in order to reach some sort of goal. I have done something like that in a game called Multiplanetary from a non-LD jam, but that's a story for another time, another video. And that's it. That's every Ludum Dare game I've ever made to date. I've not been able to take part in the last few, but I'm looking forward to and planning to enter LD54. So hopefully I'll see some of you then and there for the stream, or maybe I'll get to play something you make. I've entered jams other than Ludum Dare too. In fact, that's where PokePoke first got started. Let me know if you're interested in hearing about those other games, and I'll happily do another video. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you to my patrons for funding what I do, and thank you ever so much for watching till the end. Catch my live streams every Friday here on YouTube and also on twitch.tv/SeanJS. Until then, I'll catch you all next time.